Um, Hi everyone. My name is Jillian. I'm a student at UW-Madison, and I study insects. I am an entomologist, and that's the official name for a scientist who studies insects. And one of the really fascinating things to me about insects is all of the different ways that they are adapted to their environment. All of the different variations and varieties that you see in their body forms and the way that they use their habitat. And one way to explore all of that diversity is by looking at their different body forms. So this activity is something fun that you can do at home to explore all of the different ways that insects' bodies have been adapted to their environment. But before we get started on that, I'd like to talk about what about insect bodies make them unique, make them identifiable and different from, say, spiders, or things that kind of look like insects and are similar, but are not quite insects. And so first we're going to go through the things that make insects clearly insects, and then I'll talk a little bit about all the different ways that their bodies are adapted to their environment. So insects, you can identify them using 6 kind of key traits. Insects have 3 body segments. Sometimes this is a little bit hidden in creatures like beetles or cockroaches, but they're there. They have a head in the front, they have a thorax in the middle, and an abdomen in the back. Their head holds their brain, their eyes, just like on a person. Their thorax is where all of their legs and wings are connected, and their abdomen holds their stomach and everything else that they need to live. So there's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Insects also have an exoskeleton. This is incredibly important. Instead of having a skeleton on the inside like people have, insects have a hardened outer shell that protects them from their environment. They breathe through their exoskeleton, so they actually have little teeny tiny holes all over their body that allow them to breathe. Their skeleton protects them from predators. It helps keep them from drying out. It can also be pretty beautiful on some insects. But having an exoskeleton is something that all insects have, at least as adults. Insects also have 6 legs. So all 6 legs are attached to their thorax, the middle of their body. And we think that 6 might be a particularly interesting number because it allows for some extra stability while the insects are walking. They walk by alternating their legs on each side. And so they always have some legs on the bottom, which is really handy if you're walking along a skinny branch or trying to swim. They're always just extra stable and extra able to hold on to their surroundings. Insects also have 1 pair of antennae. Some of their relatives have 2 pairs, but insects only ever have 1. And antennae are, I think, really fascinating because they're useful for scent. So the way that we smell through our nose, insects smell through their antennae and a couple other organs that they have. But because of this really important feature, this really important sense that insects use for a lot of different things, we see some pretty interesting modifications of antennae. Sometimes they're just long and skinny, like on this kind of imaginary insect. Other times they're big and feathery. We call those plumose, like a feather plume. And we tend to see those on nocturnal insects since they rely more on scent than sight, since they're active at night. Insects also have a pair of compound eyes. Instead of having, they do look like one big eye on each side, but they're actually a bunch of little tiny kind of mini eyes that work together to create a really detailed picture of their surroundings. One of the benefits of having this sort of eye is that they're really sensitive to movement, which is why if you have a fly in your house and you're trying to catch it and bring it outside, it's really hard to catch that fly because they can see you coming. They can sense even your slow motion approach to try to catch them. They're really sensitive to movement. which is handy when a lot of things want to eat you, like birds and small mammals. So compound eyes are a really important feature of insects and something that all insects have as adults. Insects also have two pairs of wings. This is, in some groups of insects, been lost over time, but the ancestor of all insects, the original kind of insect that all other insects came from, did have two pairs of wings, and those are attached to the thorax just like the legs. Wings are a really important feature because they've allowed insects to expand the way that they use their habitat. People can only walk on the ground. You know, we build machines to be able to fly. Insects can just do it on their own. And so they're able to catch food in the air. They're able to fly away from predators. Some insects have modified their wings for other purposes too. Sometimes they can be converted and used for camouflage. On some groups of insects like beetles, they're hardened and they act like kind of a protective outer shell. And so wings serve a lot of different purposes. They're useful for flight. On a butterfly, they're useful to signal to other butterflies what kind of butterfly that they are. Sometimes they can be colorful to signal that the butterfly is toxic. On like a beetle, they're protective. They're a really key feature of why insects have become such a successful group, why we see them in so many different habitats, and why they're so abundant where they exist. And so all of these features, the 3 body segments, the exoskeleton, the 6 legs, the pair of antennae, the 1 pair of compound eyes, 2 pairs of wings. If you see a creature like this out in nature, it's probably an insect. Some things that are commonly confused for insects, like spiders. Spiders have 8 legs, 2 body segments, and so you can start to use this list to differentiate what's an insect and what's not an insect. And the things that have this list, they are almost always insects, and this list has allowed insects to become one of the most diverse, one of the most abundant types of animal on the planet. And so I'm going to share a different screen now to allow us to explore insect body types with a fun activity. Oh, just a moment, let me make this full screen. This activity is called Build a Bug, and it allows you to look at some of the different adaptations that insects have. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of adaptations. There are so many different kinds of insects, but these are some ones that we thought were kind of interesting. And so at the beginning of this activity, it describes again the purpose of things like pair of antennae, segmented body, 6 legs, to kind of remind you, in case you'd like to look at this later, what sorts of things make an insect an insect. Requires some paper, scissors to cut out parts, glue and tape to attach that together. Or if you like, you can just color and explore the different ways that you can imagine these body types being used out in nature. So the way that I like to do this activity is move through the different body types and think about how those adaptations might be used in nature. This is on the top left here, if you can see my mouse, is kind of a general drawing of what an ant head looks like. Ants have these really fantastic mandibles capable of grabbing prey, seeds, anything they want to eat, carrying things around their colonies. And so this is kind of a general form of what an ant might look like. Now flies, there are 2 really common groups of flies. One that looks more like a house fly up in this right corner of the heads that are shown right now. And they tend to have this kind of lapping mouth part. The other common type of fly is a mosquito, and they tend to have a very long mouth part, useful for sucking not just blood, but also plant sap. Most mosquitoes, most things that look like mosquitoes, like crane flies, are actually herbivores, and they prefer to eat plant sap. It's really just the pregnant females that drink blood because they're looking for nutrition for their eggs. Down here, we have a head that also has these fantastic mandibles, really big compound eyes, and this is generally what something like a beetle or a grasshopper might look like. Going a little further down, here you see a moth head, that long curly thing coming out of the front, that's the proboscis. And you can see a similar feature on the butterfly. That's generally for drinking nectar. And so the insect can extend their mouth part into the flower and get a nice tasty drink of nectar whenever they're hungry. When they're not using it, it tends to get rolled up and kind of tucked away just to keep that safe. The bottom left, we see a dragonfly. Those huge eyes are extremely useful. Dragonflies, damselflies are predators, and having big eyes like that allow them to catch their prey really easily. This is a leaf-footed bug head. Their mouth parts are actually hidden underneath their body. And that's one of the ways you can tell them apart from other insects, is they have a very long extended mouth part coming from their face down underneath them. Over here, we have different kinds of antennae. Fly antennae tend to be very reduced, very small, but they're still sensitive to things like scent. Mosquito antennae, the male tend to have very feathery, very plumose antennae, like I mentioned earlier, so that they can try to find other females to make eggs with. And this is what a female antennae would look like. They're still kind of feathery, but a little bit more reduced. Down here, we have different kinds of moth antennae. Again, the male antennae are big and feathery so that they can find a female to make eggs with. And we see that they're very, very feathery, very plumose, because moths are active at night. And so they can't rely on their vision to find a female. They have to rely on their scent. And here we have ant antennae. That kind of elbowed antennae where it comes out like this is one of the ways you can tell ants apart from other insects. Their antennae are very dexterous. They're very easy to manipulate because of that stiff initial segment of the antennae. Down here we have different body forms. Moths tend to be very furry. Beetles, like I said earlier, beetles, their first set of wings are hardened and back over their body most of the time as a way to protect them from their environment. Ants, one of the ways you can tell ants, bees, and wasps apart from other insects is they have this kind of narrow waist between their thorax and their abdomen, and that's pretty unique to this group. So if you're trying to tell apart maybe a fly that's pretending to be a wasp so that it pretends to be dangerous, that's one of the things that you can use to distinguish that. Here we have different kinds of legs.
Hey, Jillian, we have a question about the hairs on the antennae.
Oh, yeah.
The question is, does the number of hairs on the antennae relate to anything in particular?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. They can vary a little bit even within the same species. Usually, if you see a much more hairy antennae, that usually means that they're very active at night, or that there are a lot of differences in the body forms between males and females of that species. So the furrier the antennae, the more likely they are to be a nocturnal group because they have to rely more on scent. And the more likely it is that there's a big difference in between male and female insects.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, some insects have very impressive antennae. I like to think of them as like their eyebrows. They just have these fantastic fans coming out of their head. They look really neat. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, here we have different types of legs. You tend to see kind of small grasping legs on things like dragonflies and butterflies that need to either grasp onto prey or something small like the stem of a flower to drink. Um, this is one of my favorite variations of legs. These are the legs of a type of diving beetle. So some beetles are aquatic, and they spend their entire lives in water. And so sometimes we see these kind of feathery fans coming off of the back portion of their leg, and those act like flippers actually, and help them swim and navigate through the water. These legs are modified to be exceptionally good at jumping. And so we tend to see legs like this on grasshoppers, crickets, katydids, insects like that. And wings. Wings are fantastic. All flies, both the mosquito type and the housefly type, have these little appendages instead of their back wings. And if you're able to look very closely, these little appendages actually kind of spin while the insect is flying, and it helps them to balance as they're moving through the air. So if you've ever tried to catch a fly, they're particularly agile flyers, and very hard to catch. And this is partly why, is they have these little appendages that help them balance as they fly through the air. Wings can also be beautifully colorful, useful for camouflage like you see in butterflies and moths. And beetles still have their second pair of flight wings. Some beetles don't fly anymore, but they still have them kind of in there. The bodies have just kind of gotten a bit too big for the wings. But they still have that second set of wings. And so beetles tend to be not the most agile of flyers. They're very cute to watch though. On the last page, we have some more wings. Dragonflies are very interesting flyers. They move their wings a bit differently than most other insects. When they fly, they move each wing individually, which allows them to be very agile flyers, but it takes a lot of energy. If you have to think about moving all of your limbs at the same time in synchrony, it takes a lot of work. Other insects move their wings in synchrony, and so it's much easier. They move all of them up or all of them down at the same time, but it also means that they're not as agile as dragonflies. And now for the fun part. If you would like to make your own insects, I would love to see them. Please take pictures and put them in the comments. I've made some of my own. I've decided that I'm going to make fantasy insects of all different kinds. So they're not replicas of anything that you might see in the wild, but just interesting ways to combine different body forms and kind of imagine what that sort of insect might be like, what sorts of things they might do in nature, or where they might live. Or you could think about an insect that you really like a bumblebee or a ladybug, and try to put together some of the things that make a bumblebee or a ladybug. So I'd be happy to take any questions. I'd love to see the insects that you create. Please post them in the comments. I'll be around for the next 10 minutes or so in case there are any comments or questions. But thank you for watching. Again, I'm Jillian. I'm with the Insect Ambassadors at UW-Madison. And thank you for having us. This has been really nice.
We do have another question on YouTube.
Yeah.
The question is, do the larvae of insects also have 3 parts?
That's a good question. They don't have the same sort of body grouping that adult insects have. They don't have that segmentation. They do still have legs, usually. They do still have a head that's distinguishable, but they tend to be much more of a, well, depending on the insect, they can sometimes look like miniature adults, or they can look like kind of squishy blobs. Like if you find a baby bug, a baby stink bug, or a baby cockroach, they'll look like a tiny stink bug, a tiny cockroach, and you can kind of see the body segmentation there, but it's not quite complete. And then other insects like butterflies, their larvae as caterpillars don't have very much segmentation to them. And it's the same for beetles and flies. And so it's there, but it's not quite separated yet. Yeah. That's a good question.
Awesome. And then there's another question.
Good.
This one says, my wife and son are scared of bugs and think that they are dirty flies. Speak about that, question mark.
Oh, sure. So most insects are totally harmless. It's a very, very small portion of insects that can actually hurt you at all. And that's including things like bees and wasps. But most insects cannot hurt you at all. Most of them are scared of you, much more scared of you than you are of them. And then as far as them being clean or not, a lot of the purpose of, well, not purpose, but a lot of the role of insects in nature is to keep things clean. They help break down things that need to be broken down. They help forage in such a way that plants can increase their dispersal. They spread seeds around. They actually very, very regularly clean themselves because they have to be so aware of their environment since so many things eat insects. That's why I don't know if you've seen like even a bee on a flower will be constantly cleaning their antennae, and so they tend to be themselves very clean and then also help clean the environment that they're in. And so I actually think of them as sometimes more hygienic than a lot of people. Yeah, some people even keep them as pets. They're great to have around and very safe, very clean little critters.
Awesome. And then another question, are there any examples of transplants in insects?
Transplants.
Maybe whoever asked that could clarify a little more if you need some clarification.
I think transplants is in like trying to help the insect survive, that sort of thing. Not that I know of. A lot of people study insects for our medical purposes. So flies have a really developed brain system for interpreting visual cues. They have a really good visual sensory system, but it's also very simple. And so people will study the fly brain to try to understand the human brain a little bit better. But I don't know of any procedures done on insects to try to improve their health, like a transplant.
I think that answered the question well.
Okay.
And I don't see anything else coming in on YouTube yet.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you everyone for watching. It's been nice to talk about insects today. It's something that I always enjoy, so thanks.